Let's open up the TVC Phase 1 Clonetrooper figure from Attack of the Clones. Villa Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it. Hello there, thanks for visiting Villa Varykino. As a prequel fan, I'm always excited to add new prequel era 3.75-inch action figures to my collection, like this Phase 1 Clonetrooper from Attack of the Clones. I know I've been opening up a few TVC figures recently, but for us here in New Zealand, we had two waves of figures arrive at our local toy stores simultaneously. This wave that included the Phase 1 Clonetrooper, Count Dooku, Cassian Andor, alongside the wave of A New Hope figures and Clone Commander Rex. So it's been a very exciting time for TVC collectors here in New Zealand, and of course I am among them. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll get this Clonetrooper figure out of the packaging so we can take a closer look at all of the details. But first, let's take one closer look at the backing card. So let's take a closer look at the backing card of this Phase 1 Clonetrooper. I just have an earlier carded Clonetrooper figure on hand for comparison. This one is VC240 from the Clone Wars. I really like the yellow accent color that they used for the Phase 1 Clonetrooper. As we can see, the reference shot from Attack of the Clones, there was a lot of orange and yellow tones in that epic shot where we see the galactic army all sort of being loaded off for deployment for Geonosis. So I really like the yellow tones. It really sets off this backing card art. We can see from the bubble we have a helmeted character here that with a helmet that's going to fit over his face, which I really like. And we have two weapons. Of course, the Clone Troopers have an assortment of weapons. Fun that we've got options here as well. I really like the design of this one. Of course, it's referencing those original vintage Kenner backing cards with the racetrack here, and we've got that lovely strong red Attack of the Clones logo there at the top. We have the warning text box up the top. I know the most recent A New Hope wave moves it down to the bottom, but that's more because of that extra little A New Hope artwork component, so it doesn't impact there. So we still have it here up at the top. So let's take a closer look at the back because we've got some interesting differences here. So for a lot of the vintage collection line, we had a back of the backing card inspired by the retro Kenner backing cards where we could see all of the other figures that we could collect. In modern times, we use the number of figures on the back to identify backing cards. So I kind of like that we still had those colored squares and action figures from the assortment on the back of backing cards. We can see this one is VC240. The more recent backing cards from the vintage collection line have changed, and I'm not sure if I prefer this one or not. I think I'm still very nostalgic about the darker tones here with the black and the colored squares. Now we have a blurb about the character. We have Phase 1 Clonetrooper. In the beginning phases of the Clone Wars, the introduction of white armored clone troopers in the Republic's Grand Army represented the future of galactic warfare. And here we have a picture of the front of the backing card here on the back and a posed picture of the action figure in front of the backing card. This one is VC309, and then we still have a large wall of sort of copyright text, all of that sort of stuff with the barcode there on the back. Let me know, which one do you prefer? I kind of like having the picture of the figure painted here with the sort of posing and his weapon there. But there's just something classic and original about that backing style, so I think I do prefer it. Just a quick little look at the figures on the front before we open them up. So as you can see, this is a Phase 2 Clone Trooper. Like generally we think of the 501st Legion Troopers from Episode 3. This version is from the Clone Wars. This one here is a Phase 1 Clone Trooper from the movie. So we've got animated style and movie style. And just looking at them very quickly in the packaging side by side, we can see the proportions of these two figures are very different. This one is a lot skinnier and narrow, especially when we compare the thighs and the chest. I very much prefer the proportions of the movie Clone Trooper armor here. So I'm kind of hoping that perhaps we will get a reissue of the 501st paint job with this particular body sculpt, because for the most part the Clone Trooper armor itself doesn't change between Episode 2 and Episode 3. It is predominantly the helmet that changes, which is, as you can see, a separate swappable component. This one does have a Clone Trooper face sculpt underneath the helmet. This one we have the helmet packaged beside so we can see the face sculpt, which I kind of like being able to see the face sculpt underneath. So some Clone Trooper figures, like the recent Clone Commander Rex that came out in the wave just after this one, had basically two components. We had a head that stuck on and then a helmet that stuck on. You didn't stick it over the helmet. They were two separate, so you had to pop the human head off in order to put the helmet on. That kind of eliminates the proportions of either having a too small head or a too big helmet. So I'm kind of keen to see how well the proportions of this one work, because this helmet does fit over the human sculpted face here. So is it going to be well proportioned? Is it going to look a little bit big because it's fitting over the head? I guess we'll have to open it up and take a look. So let's get stuck into it. So now I have the Phase 1 Clone Trooper figure and the accessories out of the packaging so we can take a closer look at the details. So first things first, I noticed his feet are just a little bit wonky. I am going to have to play around with some of the posing later on. I do have some action figure stands on hand in case I find that he just needs a little bit of extra stability. Personally, I do like clear stands for my 3.75-inch action figures. In particular, I really don't like them falling off my display shelf and potentially losing accessories. So I like the face sculpt here for this Clone Trooper. I do see sort of the slightly younger Temuera Morrison face here. Of course, we don't really see him wearing the armor in Attack of the Clones. Predominantly, most of the Clone Troopers in that film were computer generated, so the armor is a little bit different, especially like the helmets. They were never made as physical helmets to be worn over a human head, so it's kind of interesting to see how they're going to translate figures over time with all of these CG things where the physics doesn't really work quite the same way. So I like the face sculpt. We've got very dark hair that is painted pretty neatly. I like the texture on it. It's painted pretty black, but I can see the texture there going all the way around. Nice and tidy around the hairline. With such a strong color, it really does throw your eye if there's something that's not quite right, especially with the contrast to the skin tone there. I like the paint job on the face. This era of digital printing really does get some fine detail work. Even though I own quite a few Clone Trooper figures over the years, ever since the prequel era, I do like to see the improvements that Hasbro has done over the years. Like I mentioned earlier, I do like the proportions through the chest here. It's a little bit sort of broader, a little bit more of a bulk to it than the animated style Clone Troopers that are a little bit sort of thinner in most general proportions. So let's check out some of the sculpting, because we don't really have much of the paint job to check out. We've got black accented here under the undersuit, of course. The Clone Troopers have a ridged undersuit, so we can see that at all of the articulation points. I do think the Clone Trooper armor, because it hides so much, does work very well for articulation. We've got sort of elbow armor and knee armor, which is different to, of course, the Galactic Empire Stormtroopers that don't have a lot of these sort of extra components. So we do have a bit more of an exposed articulation on classic Stormtrooper figures. So pretty tidy paintwork all round. We have a sort of a mid-gray with a green tint on the soles of the shoes there, but overall pretty tidy. I think I've got a little bit of a paint flaw just on the back of the hand armor here. That looks like this has been perhaps pressed up against something. We've got a very small sort of black marking there. Because the hands are sculpted in black plastic, the back of the hand armor is one of the few components on these that is actually made out of black plastic and painted white. For the most part, this is white plastic with the black parts painted, but on the whole, you can just make out the differences in weights between this white paint and white plastic, but it doesn't actually really catch my eye. It's very, very subtle. Of course, we do know, unfortunately, Clone Troopers, for me personally, were one of those figures that yellowed a lot over the years, even in my room with no windows. So, of course, painted ones won't go yellow like the plastic does over time, so this difference may change over time. We also have a slightly different sort of texture or finish on the belt. And I can't quite tell if that's because it's made in a different plastic or the belt is painted. I know for the Stormtroopers, the belt is rubbery because of the drop boxes that hang down over the tops of the thighs, so they have to flex. This one feels like it might be a slightly different plastic, I think, but without sort of cutting into it, because nothing moves on this. It's really hard to tell if this is flexible rubber like Stormtrooper belts, and I don't really feel like pulling my action figure apart. So I think that that's interesting. Just to sort of, I can feel it. It feels just a little bit different there. So let's check out the articulation. Because Clonetrooper armor covers so much of the body, it can be a little bit tricky, particularly around the shoulders. On some of the other Clonetrooper figures, they have quite rubbery shoulder armor pieces here. So let's see if this one, okay, so this one does actually fit underneath the shoulder straps. I wasn't expecting that. I thought it might impact on it. So I can get his arms all the way up. Generally not going to do that pose, but good to see. Pretty standard head movement, nice and free there. We've got that nice black undersuit. It doesn't technically go all the way up to the ears like that. That would be very, very high, but of course it's just easier to make the neck piece in black plastic. That makes sense. So, oh, nice and easy at the elbows. I like that. Because 3.75 inch figures are so small, I get anxious when the joints are very stiff. The actual pieces of plastic connecting to each other are very small. I feel like I worry about breaking something if they don't move freely. But of course, we don't want really loose joints where everything starts to flop around. That's when they really can't stand up on their own. So we're going to test out some poses with his Clonetrooper blaster rifles in a moment, because of course two-handed weapons, we do need to see some good articulation with the hands there. Of course, we've got to be able to sort of get two hands together to hold the rifles, so I'm going to test that out shortly. Nice movement there at that sort of mid-torso articulation point. We've got backwards and forwards, side to side, very nice there. And we've generally got some pretty free movement here at the hips. There is a seam just hidden across the top of the thigh, so I can rotate that round. You might be able to see that the white armor is actually moving over the black of the leg. This isn't rotating at the top of the hip. That's moving there, so you can sort of rotate the feet outward, which is kind of interesting. And it does, because the armor comes up to this point, it does mean that we can move it away, and it kind of comes in more at the side rather than hitting at the front, so we can do these very sort of high kicks. So let's check out his knees. Okay, a little stiff, there we go. Okay. Of course, the knee armor on this particular sculpt is attached to the shins, so when we bend his knees, we can sort of see the articulation exposed there. Sometimes I like it when it's kind of coming down from the thigh armor, because it kind of hangs over the knee and kind of hides that a little bit in the bent knee position. And let's see the ankles there. Okay. Little stiff. I am going to have to play around with the sort of articulation at the ankles. It varies so much from figure to figure. Sometimes you get them posed well. He's a little bit, this particular foot's kind of angled, kind of in a slightly sort of awkward angle. It's not completely straight, so he is a little bit tricky to sort of stand up. So I'm probably going to put him on a base in a little bit, but I think he looks cool. So before I start really putting on all of the accessories, I'm going to grab out that other Clonetrooper that I had as a carded one earlier. I have opened this one up before. I have two of them, one carded, one loose. As I said before, this is VC240. This is the animated Clone Wars version of the Clonetrooper armor. So you can see how skinny the legs of this animated version look compared next to this live action version. I know technically this is phase 1 and phase 2, but from the neck down, it's pretty much identical. So we can even see they both have subtle paint flaws on the back of the hand armor there. This does seem to be a spot that does get a little bit roughed up during production. They both have flaws in the same places. So there we go. So we do have some differences here. I can see that the elbow armor is sort of sculpted with a white line. Here it is completely in line with that bicep armor. but I really do like the proportions of this one. This one looks like a human being. An actual soldier is wearing the armor. This one looks so thin. It doesn't look like, you know, somebody that's charging into battle, that's fit and active, who's gone through military training. He looks a little bit skinny for the proportions there. You know, I know they have to be accurate to the animated show, but yes, this one I picked up too because it's been a while since we've had a 501st Clonetrooper. I wanted to have a couple for my displays, but they don't really fit alongside the movie 501st ones. They're definitely animated show. And you can kind of see across the shoulders and across the chest. This one just looks a little bit more bulked out. The proportions where all the armor sits around those upper arms and the chest, this one looks very, very skinny. If we think about where the torso would be underneath the armor, it just looks very small compared to this one here. I'm very much a fan of the proportions here. And we can see the face sculpts are very different. There's obviously a few years between the Phase 1 Clonetroopers as we see them in Attack of the Clones and the faces that we would see in the sort of Order 66 501st Clonetroopers. They've seen some action. They're a little bit more weathered. I think it's kind of interesting in particular. The thing that really strikes me is the forehead sort of creases. The frown lines on this one are a little bit more prominent. We've just got a little bit of a forehead crease sculpted on this one. These ones are definitely a little bit deeper. So yes, I think that that's kind of interesting. On the whole, a little bit different. We've sort of got the peaked hair sculpted a bit differently. This has got very glossy hair. This one is a little bit more, just a tiny bit more matte as a finish. On the back, this one does not have any painted details on the thermal detonator on the back of the chest plate, whereas here we've got lots of painted details there and there. And obviously the blue is obviously a paint job there as well. And the knees are also more sculpted as a separate band on this one. Here they are sculpted across the top of that calf armor, and we have different colored soles of the shoes. I know this isn't a direct comparison, but this was one of the most plainest Clonetroopers that I have in my collection from recent vintage collection waves. Not every vintage collection wave makes it here to New Zealand, so this one is the closest I have to compare, and so I figure some other collectors might have that same issue as well. Even the butt plate on this one is a little bit wider. This one's a very skinny butt plate. I think that that's kind of interesting. So yeah, in case you have this one and are wondering how that's different, those are those two side by side. I very much like the proportions of this one. It feels like an actual human being is wearing it. So, of course, when we're talking about proportions, I'll just pop this one off to the side. We can't discuss that without talking about the helmet. So of course we have the iconic Phase 1 Clonetrooper helmet here. I love this one. I was just, those scenes where we see all of the Clonetroopers readying for battle, it just, it was such a dramatic scene. I love this helmet. It's so iconic. And so we've got quite tidy painting on this one. Of course, we've got lovely black detail here for the visor, black stripe. We've got details going down to the back, very fine. We've got little tube stripes here down the side, a little red detail there at the top of that fin, very tidy. And you can see that we have a bit of a squish here on both directions. I do find sometimes you get an unfortunate one where it's kind of like a little bit more squished and you kind of got to really play around with it to fit it over the human head. So let's go ahead and see how well this is going to fit on, because this sometimes it can look like a bobblehead because plastic it has to be a certain thickness. So we're adding bulk over the human head. So let's see how well. Okay, that fits on very well. Okay, just kind of clicked straight on there, went on very fast. So he was not packaged with the helmet on in the packaging like that 501st Clonetrooper from the Clone Wars was. And I know that is a bit tricky for collectors because sometimes you want to see the proportions of the figure before you buy it, and because it's packaged beside it, you don't know how well it's going to look when worn on the body, especially if you're planning to buy a few of these, because these are perfect for army building. You don't want to go and buy 6, get them home, open them up, and then discover that, ooh, you don't like that proportion on the helmet. Maybe you'll skip this release and wait for a later one. The Clone Commander Rex figure that came out after this one has sort of a helmet with that peg, so you just click the whole thing on and then you sort of pop it off and put the headpiece on. It's not a separate helmet that fits over the headpiece, which eliminates the issues of the proportions. They can both be the right scale because you're not trying to fit plastic over plastic. I do get anxious popping pieces off my action figures, but it does eliminate the issue of scale. So I think this is one of those instances where it feels very close, but perhaps a little on the big side. I think the ultimate way to sort of test this is to try and take the most square on picture you can and then kind of use Photoshop to kind of overlay it over like a promo photo from Attack of the Clones and sort of really see how well it is scaled. Could be a little on the large side. I don't know. I know it's one of those things that we do get anxious about, so sometimes I'm a little bit worried that I'm reading more into it than it actually is with my eyes. If you're expecting something to look like a bobblehead, then you go and put it on, you're going to think it's that. It's a little bit hard to tell. I don't think it's the worst I've seen. It just, yeah. And I can see the chin underneath, which, depending on just a little bit of plastic, sometimes you can kind of push a little bit under the head, kind of get that a little bit hidden, a little bit better underneath there. It's not the worst. I've had some figures where the chin is visible underneath no matter what you do. That hides fairly well underneath there. But yes, let's try getting some accessories into his hands. So, of course, this figure comes with 2 Clonetrooper blaster rifles. I think it's a very confusing naming thing because they are both known as DC-15A. So, the short one, DC-15A blaster carbine, also known as the DC-15S blaster. We have the long one, the DC-15A blaster rifle, also known as the DC-15 blaster rifle. So generally speaking, I will refer to this as the rifle. This one will be the carbine. But yeah, I kind of wish they'd chosen different numbers. You know, we all know that E11, you know, it's kind of just useful to have separate numbers. So this one is a little bit flexy. It's not completely rigid. There's a lot of flex, particularly in the section here. This one of shorter, we've just got a little bit of flex there. Overall, I don't think these are black plastic. They're like a very dark gray. Nice sculpting details, nothing too sort of fancy. They are different. If I grab the one that came with my 501st one, we can see the color difference here and the scale, actually, the scale of the Clone Wars one is very small compared to this one, and this one is black. And so, of course, I'm not comparing direct. These are not directly the same live action blaster rifle. I just think it's interesting. We've got a big difference in scale. You can see all of those details are very different, going all the way through to the grips and all of those details. Very, very different there. So this one is the Clone Wars 501st Trooper, so animated style, phase 2. And here we have a movie version, Attack of the Clones, phase 1. And we'll have that same difference, I am expecting, maybe, maybe not, with the carbine. Kind of hard to hold them. We've got a little bit of a closer, because of course the scale can't be too different. But this one does have flatter details and does feel smaller. If I can put them just on my hands, they're about the same length, but this one just feels very much smaller scale. They are not exactly the same. Different plastic too. This one is black, this one is that sort of dark gray metallic sort of gunmetal color, and this one is a little bit thinner. So interesting there. You can see that this one has sort of like a longer magazine in the side of this one, which I think is interesting. A little bit more there. Okay, so let's see how well this figure is going to hold it. It's always kind of fun just to compare with other figures that we have. I know that for certain collectors, you might not be able to afford or justify every single new figure that Hasbro makes. So being able to compare it with, say, a figure that you might already own and see, is this worth upgrading? So that went into his hands very easy. He's got an extended trigger finger, which does fit into that trigger guard very nicely there. I'm not the best at posing my action figures. I do like to take my time and spend a little bit of time later getting them into the perfect poses. Just going to see if I can get this past his fingers. He's got a very tight grip on his left hand. You can see there's not a lot of gap there. So it's going to take a little bit of really pushing to get his fingers to open up. Let's see if I can get him to just wiggle that thumb out of the way. Okay. And now he's lost that grip. So yes, I'm probably going to spend a bit of time working on these poses, but for the most part, I like them to be able to hold it at least in their dominant hand nice and cleanly. It's a little bit awkward sometimes when that trigger finger doesn't quite fit in the right spot, then they're kind of holding it really awkward. So we can at least get that in there, and I will put up some pictures because generally if I spend a little bit longer I can slowly tweak the hands and get them into a proper position later on for display, because yeah, this is kind of what I like to refer to as my sort of my playtime with my figures. I'm checking out all the articulation, I'm checking out just the features and things like that, and then of course I'm going to spend a bit of time working on the poses before I add them to my display, where I'm generally not really going to touch them much. You know, I do rearrange my action figures from time to time, but of course they're not getting played with like the Kenner toys were in the 70s. So this one is going to be even a little bit harder because it's such a long rifle. Not sure where the best place to try and put his second hand grip in here is. Just going to try it here. That thumb is very close to his fingers. That's a very tight grip, which could be a positive or a negative depending on how you look at things. So yeah, just with very simple attempts. He's got a very tight grip on this hand. I'm going to have to sort of see if I can wiggle his fingers and get that grip to loosen up, because he kind of just looks like he's presenting a gun to somebody for you. It's a little bit awkward. I'm sorry, that's not the best pose. I'll put some pictures up once I've actually spent some time working on the posing here. But yes, I do like that we've got two weapons here, so you can mix and match, decide which ones you prefer to pose with your figures, because of course they're both iconic Clonetrooper weapons. So I'm just going to try putting him on a stand that I have here. So he's got some decent sized peg holes here because this one is not going to stand up well. We can wiggle him on. So now we can, so you can kind of see that foot is it's just angled. I'm going to have to spend a bit of time. They generally don't articulate the ankles side to side much. It's more of a front to back movement. Definitely going to have to spend a bit of time, but he does fit well on a stand. Some of my recent figures have had a little bit of a tight or shallow peg hole, so they just kind of hover on the plastic acrylic bases. Sometimes I feel like I need to go in there and sand those pegs just a tiny bit, because I am not gluing my figures to their bases. I refuse to do that. And blue tack just doesn't work over time, I find. I do like to put them on clear stands. Just keeps them nice and secure on display. So there you go. I think it's pretty cool. I do think I will be picking up another one. There's just something, you know, just the classic black and white for the army builders amongst us. I think he looks cool. I love this scene in Attack of the Clones. I really like that they chose that particular dramatic army scene for the backing card picture. I think it was perfect. We had a nice clear picture of the clone troopers for the backing card. I like the paint detail. Mine looks pretty tidy. So there we go. That was a lot of fun. I added another clone trooper to my clone trooper action figure army. So there you go. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another Star Wars action figure collectible and had some fun. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again for more Star Wars fun very soon. May the Force be with you. If you're a TVC fan, I recently opened up the Clone Commander Rex figure VC309. That video is linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole vintage collection playlist. This is the way.